Chapter 7a First Command. The first news that the knights heard on their return from their expedition was that the Grand Master Orsini was seriously ill, and that, at his advanced age, the doctors feared there was little hope of his rallying. Gervase felt a keen regret on hearing that the kind and gentle old man, who had been for 3 years his master, was at the point of death. Nevertheless, it was generally felt among the knights that, in view of the dangers that threatened Rhodes, it was for the good of the order that a strong and capable man, whom all respected, and who possessed their entire confidence, should at such a time be invested with absolute power. Audiobooks had, indeed, for some years been the real head of the community, but every question had, if only as a matter of form, to be referred to the Grand Master in order to obtain his approval and signature. In the state of feebleness to which he had for some months past fallen, much time was frequently lost before he could be made to understand the questions referred to him. Moreover, orders of Audiobooks could be appealed against, his views thwarted, and his authority questioned, and it was therefore felt that, much as they all respected the old Grand Master, it would be an advantage to the order when the supreme authority passed into the hands of Audiobooks. For days after the return of the expedition, Orsini died. A few hours later, the Grand Council was convened, and Audiobooks unanimously elected Grand Master of the Order. The ceremony of the funeral of his predecessor was an imposing one. Every knight of the Order in Rhodes was present, together with a number of the leading natives of the island, and although Gervase had, since his arrival on the island, seen many stately ceremonies, this far surpassed anything he had previously beheld. Gervase had, at one of his first interviews with Audiobooks after his arrival at the island, been advised by him to acquire some knowledge of Turkish. "There are but few knights of the Order who speak the language," he said. "As a rule, while young men are ready to devote any amount of time to acquiring dexterity in all martial exercises, they will bestow no labor in obtaining knowledge that may be fully as useful to them as skill in arms. In our dealings with the Turks, one or other party has to employ an interpreter, and it is often by no means certain that these men convey the full meaning of the speeches they translate. Again, we have large numbers of Turkish slaves, and it is highly to be desired that the knights should be able to give their orders to these men in their own language. Lastly, a knight who has been taken prisoner by the Turks, and even the bravest might meet with such a misfortune, would find it an alleviation of his lot and might be able to plan and carry out his escape, did he speak Turkish well. I should strongly counsel you to acquire a knowledge of the tongue." Gervase had intended to follow the advice of the Grand Prior, but the duties of his office as page, and the time required for his military exercises and his studies with the chaplain, had rendered it well nigh impossible, during the first 3 years, to turn his attention to learning Turkish. As soon as his pageship was at an end, and he found that his duties included supervision of Turkish slaves, he felt the want of a knowledge of the language, and from that time devoted an hour a day to its study, employing one of the servants of the auberge, who was a man of rank and education at home, to instruct him. While he conscientiously spent this amount of time at the work, it was the most disagreeable portion of this day's labor. The events, however, that had taken place during the expedition had impressed him greatly with the utility of a knowledge of Turkish, for had it not been for Sir John Boswell's possessing some acquaintance with the language, it would have been impossible to communicate with the rowers of their boat, or to have arranged the plan by which they had escaped the pirates. He had then, and there determined that as soon as he returned to Rhodes he would take the matter up in a very different spirit to that in which he before approached it. He had on the way home spoken to Sir John, who had highly approved of the determination. "I myself, when I was a young knight of 18, was taken captive, 26 years ago, at the time when the Egyptian fleet appeared before Rhodes. Our galleys advanced to attack them, but under cover of night they retired, and proceeding to the mainland took shelter under the guns of a Turkish fort. We attacked them there. It was a desperate engagement, but without any decisive advantage on either side. We lost no less than 60 knights, the Egyptians 700 men, and their fleet returned to Egypt. I and 3 others who were left wounded on the deck of one of their ships we had boarded, but failed to capture, were carried to Egypt, and remained there captive for 6 months, when we were ransomed by the order. During that time I learnt enough of their language, which is akin to Turkish, to be able to make myself understood and to understand what was said to me. I have kept up that much for intercourse with the slaves and servants at Rhodes, and have found it very useful. I consider, then, that you will do well to acquire their tongue. It will be useful not only to yourself, but to others, And when we get back I will, if you like, ask the bailiff to free you from all duty in order that you may devote yourself to it." The head of the Langue at once granted Sir John's request. "I would," he said, "that more of our young knights would give a portion of their time to study, but most of them look to returning home when their term of service here has expired. Many think only of amusement, and all imagine that advancement is best achieved by valor. Tresham has already distinguished himself very greatly, so much so that I think it would be well if he did not go on another expedition for a time, but stayed here while others have the opportunity of doing the same. Were we to send him out with the next galleys that start, I should be accused of favoritism, and the lad, who is now deservedly popular with all, would be regarded with envy, and possibly even with dislike. At the same time, after what he has done I should have difficulty in refusing, were he to volunteer to sail in the next galley that sets out. The desire, then, on his part to learn Turkish is in all ways opportune. It will, too, in the long run be of great advantage to him in the order, will give him weight, and bring him into prominence. I do not think there are 6 in the order who can fairly translate a Turkish document. There are but 2 who could write a reply in the same language. Inform him, then, that from the present time he will be excused from all work, except, of course, to join in ceremonials when all are required to be present, and if you, Sir John, will pick out from among the servitors here one who is well instructed and educated, and capable of writing as well as reading his language, I will similarly relieve him of all other work, and place him at the disposal of young Tresham. Tell the lad that I hope he will persevere until he obtains a complete knowledge of the tongue. You can mention to him what I have said as to my opinion of the advantage the knowledge of it will be to him in the order." Gervase accordingly devoted himself to study. His instructor was a Turk of fine presence. He had been a large landowner in Syria and held a high official position in the province, but had been captured in a galley on his way to Constantinople, whither he was proceeding on an official mission. He was delighted with his new post. Gervase, both as the youngest member of the community and from the kind manner in which he always spoke to the servants, all of whom had acquired some knowledge of English, was a general favourite among them, and the Turk was glad that he was to be thrown with him. Still more he rejoiced at being appointed his instructor, as it relieved him from all menial work which, although preferable to that to which the bulk of the slaves were condemned, yet galled his spirit infinitely. Now that he had entered upon the work with the approbation of his superior, and a conviction of its great utility, Gervase set to work with the same zeal and ardour which he had exhibited in his military exercises. During the heat of the day he sat in the shade reading and writing with his instructor. In the cool of the morning and afternoon he walked with him on the walls, or in the country beyond them. After sunset he sat with him in an unfrequented corner of the roof, all the time conversing with him either of his own country, or that of his instructor. At first this was difficult, and he had to eke out the Turkish words he had acquired with English, but it was not long before there was no necessity for this. His intercourse for 10 or 12 hours a day with this Turk, and the pains taken by his instructor, caused him to acquire the language with extreme rapidity. Of course, he had to put up with a great deal of banter from the younger knights upon his passion for study. Sometimes they pretended that his mania, as they considered it, arose from the fact that he was determined to become a renegade, and was fitting himself for a high position in the Turkish army. At other times they insisted that his intention was to become a Turkish dervish, or to win a great Turkish heiress and settle in Syria. But as he always bore their banter good-temperedly, and was ready occasionally to join them in the sport when assaults at arms were carried on, they soon became tired of making fun of him. After 9 months' constant work, the young knight's studies were abruptly stopped by the receipt of a letter from the Pasha of Syria, offering a considerable sum for the ransom of his instructor. The request was at once acceded to, as it was the policy of the knights to accept ransoms for their prisoners, both because the sums so gained were useful, and because they were themselves compelled sometimes to pay ransom for members of the order. Suleiman Ali was, it was arranged, to be put on board an Egyptian craft bound for Acre, a safe conduct having been sent for the vessel and her crew, and for a knight, who was to receive the ransom from the Pasha. At any rate, Sir Gervase, the Turk said, when the young knight expressed great regret at his leaving them, our position as instructor and pupil would have come to an end shortly. For the last 3 months there has been but little teaching between us, we have talked, and that has been all, save that for a short time each day you read and wrote. But there has been little to teach. You speak the native language now as fluently as I do, and would pass anywhere as a Syrian, especially as there are slight differences of speech in the various provinces. I believe that in Syria you would not be suspected of being anything but a native, and assuredly you would be taken for a Syrian, well enough for practical purposes, Ralph. At any rate, I wrote a complimentary letter this morning from the Grand Master to the Governor of Syria and the Bailiff of Spain, who was, as you know, for 10 years a prisoner among the Turks, read it through at D'Aubuson's request, to see that there was no error in it, and was good enough to pass it without alteration. I would give a good deal, Sir Giles Trevor said, if I could follow your example, and shut myself up for 9 months with an infidel to study his language, but I could not do it if my life depended on it. I should throw myself off the wall at the end of the first fortnight. I don't pretend that I can do what Tresham has done, Ralph Harcourt said. I always hated our lessons with the chaplain, who gave me the character of having the thickest head of any of his pupils, but I vow, and he kissed the handle of his dagger, I will spend half an hour a day in trying to learn something of Turkish. Of course, I know that such time will not be enough to learn a great deal, but if one could get up just enough to be able to give orders to the slaves, to question the captain of a vessel one has captured, and to make them understand a little, if by bad luck one fell into their hands, it would be quite enough for me. I am sure sometimes one is quite at a loss how to pass the hours when the sun is at its hottest, and if one tried one ought to be able to pick up a little without much trouble. Look at the servants, there is not one of them but speaks a little English. And if an infidel can learn enough English to get on with, without any regular study, I can't see why we shouldn't be able to learn enough Turkish in the same way. 2 or 3 of the other young knights declared that they too would devote a short time during the heat of the day to learning Turkish, and they agreed to begin together forthwith with one of the servants, who spoke English most fluently. Robert Rivers was not present, for he had returned to England 6 months before, to take up his residence at the house in Clerkenwell, in order that he might bring to bear the interest of his many powerful friends to secure for him an appointment as commander of one of the estates of the order in England. His departure had caused general satisfaction among the other knights, whom his arrogance and ill temper had frequently irritated. Jervis especially was glad at his leaving the island, for after he received the honour of knighthood, Rivers made a point of always addressing him with an affectation of deference and respect that often tried his temper to the utmost. "It is well that Rivers has gone," Ralph said, laughing, "for I don't know how he would have supported the chagrin your appointment would have given him. He was devoured with jealousy as it was, but this would have been a trial beyond bearing." "I am heartily glad he has gone," Jervis said gravely. "I have put up with a great deal from him, but I don't think I could have stood much more. If our vows had not forbidden our fighting I should have called him to account long ago, but the only thing else to do was for me to lodge a formal complaint before the bailiff of his continually offensive bearing and manner, which I could not bring myself to do, and indeed there was no special matter that would have seemed to justify me, no single speech that in itself would warrant such grave action on my part. I used to wish over and over again that we could but meet in some quiet spot in England, both unarmed, and could there settle the matter in good English fashion, with our fists, or even with a couple of quarterstaffs." The others laughed. "That would be a very unknightly form of contest." "I care not for that," Jervis replied. "It would be a very satisfactory one anyhow, and quite serious enough for the occasion." His sneers and petty insults were not sufficient to justify the drawing of blood, and there has been enough of that shed for the last 20 years in England without 2 brother knights betaking themselves to their swords against each other. But a sound thrashing would have done neither of us harm, and if it had fallen to his lot to get the largest share of it, it might have done him some good. "He thinks he is sure of an appointment," one of the others said, "but he has been so frequently in trouble here that it is likely that the official report, which is always sent home to the Grand Prior when the knights return to England, will be so unfavourable that even the most powerful influence will fail to obtain him a post. If so, we may have him back here again, especially if the Turks carry out their threat of assailing us, for an appeal will be made to all the Grand Priors for knights to aid in the defence." That evening Jervis went again to the palace to receive final instructions. "The craft in which you are to travel is an Egyptian trader. As at present war has not been formally declared between us and the Sultan, peaceful traders, as you know, carry on their avocations unmolested either by the warships of the Turks or by ours. They do not enter our ports without a special permit, and the crews are never allowed to land, in order that no detailed account of our fortifications may be taken to the Sultan. Moreover, brawls might arise between them and the native population, or they might aid slaves to escape. However, you will be altogether safe from interference from Turkish war vessels, and if overhauled by one of them the safe conduct will be sufficient to prevent interference with you. But it is not so with pirates. They will plunder their own countrymen as readily as they will Christians, and the safeguard of the governor of Syria will be of no use whatever to you. In this consists the danger of your mission. I cannot send one of our war galleys on such an errand, and if there are not enough knights on board to beat off any pirate, the fewer there are the better. I hear that the craft is a fast sailer, and as the crew will be as anxious to avoid pirates as you, they will do their best to escape. I leave it to you to take any route. You can either sail hence direct for Acre, or you can coast along the shores of Anatolia and Syria, lying up at night in bays. Should you be overtaken, I do not think it would be of any use for you to disguise yourself, for some of the crew would be sure to denounce you. Should the worst happen, and you are captured by pirates, you will of course in the first place show them your safe conduct, and if I find that you do not return, I shall send at once to the governor of Syria, complaining of your capture when furnished with his safeguard, and requesting him to order a search for you to be made at every port on the coast, with instructions that you are to be at once released and either sent to him for return hither or placed on board a craft bound for any Christian port, while you, on your part, will endeavor to acquaint the Turkish authorities with the fact that you have been seized while traveling with a safe conduct from the governor of Syria. But, more than from any efforts on your part or mine, I rely upon Suleiman Ali, who will, I am sure, as soon as he is set on shore, lose no time in acquainting the Pasha of your capture, and in calling upon him to interfere in your favor. In that case, the worst that could befall you would be a temporary detention, unless, indeed, the pirates should take you to Egypt. As that country is friendly with us at present, since Egypt dreads the ever-increasing power of the Turks, it will be but a question of ransom, for I have secret agents there who will inform me without delay of the arrival of a Christian captive. I understand, sir, and will do my best in the matter. If I am captured, I trust that an opportunity of escape will soon present itself, for I should, if taken, conceal from my captors the fact that I understand their language, and should thus, if I could evade my guard, have every chance of escaping. As in a native dress I could meet and converse with those hunting for me, without their having a suspicion of my being the white slave for whom they were in search. Once at Acre you will be safe. But do not land unless it is absolutely necessary, for you might fall a victim to the fanaticism of its inhabitants, and no knight has ever set foot on shore there since the ill-fated day when the Moslems wrested it from us, bathed the ruined walls with the best blood of our order and the Templars, and destroyed the last hope of our ever recovering the Holy Sepulchre. The next morning at daybreak Jervis and Suleiman Ali went on board the Egyptian trader and sailed for Acre. The current of opinion had changed at the auberge when the knights came to think over the mission on which Jervis was about to start, and the slight feeling of jealousy with which the younger knights had received the news was entirely dissipated. While it did not seem to them that there was any chance of his distinguishing himself, they perceived, as they thought it over, the considerable danger there was of capture by pirates, and Ralph and some of his companions came down to the mole to see him off, with feelings in which envy bore no part whatever. I see now, Jervis, that it is truly no holiday excursion on which you are starting. I should envy you greatly were you going in command of an armed galley, prepared to beat off any craft that might try to overhaul you, but, going alone as you are, it is a very different thing. Should pirates meet you, you could offer no resistance, and your position would be a perilous one indeed. However, I think you are born to good luck, and am confident that your patron saint will look after you, and therefore expect to see you back here in a fortnight's time at the outside. I hope so with all my heart, Ralph. It will be no fault of mine if I tarry. Will you keep the open sea, or skirt the land, Tresham? One of the others asked. I shall keep the open sea. The Grand Master left me to choose my course, but I think there is more danger by the coast, where pirates may be hiding in unfrequented bays, in readiness to pounce upon a passing craft, than in the open sea, where we should have at least the advantage that we could not be taken by surprise, and might make a race of it. But the sun will be up in a few minutes, and my orders were to set out at sunrise, so I must say good-bye at once. As soon as the vessel was under way, Jervis took a seat on the poop by the side of Suleiman Ali, and related to him the conversation he had had with the Grand Master. The risk that you will run has not escaped me, the Turk said, and indeed, I now regret that you were chosen as my escort. I almost wish that my son had not purchased my freedom at the present time, since it involves the risk of you losing yours. There is no doubt that the sea swarms with pirates. The Sultan is too busy with his own struggles for empire to bestow any attention upon so small a matter. The Pashas and the officers of the ports have not the power, even had they the will, to put down piracy in their districts, and indeed are, as often as not, participators in the spoils. Your order, which ye Chapter 8 An Evening at Rhodes. Suleiman Allah's advice was carried out. It added considerably to the length of the voyage, but they saw only one doubtful craft. She was lying close inshore under the shadow of the sand hills, and they did not see her until she hoisted her sails and shot out from the land. They were, however, 3 miles distant from the land at the time, and the wind was blowing from the north. Consequently, the pirate was dead to leeward. Every sail was set at once on board the trader, and, being a fast sailor, she maintained her position until nightfall. The wind then dropped, and just as the light faded they could see that the vessel behind them had put out her sweeps. The trader kept up her sails until certain that she could be no longer seen, then the canvas was lowered, and the crew took to the boats and towed her due north. The night was fortunately a dark one, and those watching anxiously from the deck of the trader were unable to discern her pursuer as she passed behind them. As soon as they were well assured that she must have gone on, the boats were got in, the sails hoisted again, and, taking advantage of every light flaw of wind, they proceeded on their course. In the morning the sails of the galley could be seen on the horizon, but the distance was too great for her to take up the pursuit again with any chance of success, and the trader continued her course to Acre without seeing more of her. As soon as the trader entered the port, the Egyptian captain went on shore, taking with him a copy of the safe conduct and the letter from the Grand Master to the Pasha. Going to the residence of the governor, he handed these to him, saying that he had on board Aga Suleiman Ali, and a knight who was charged to deliver him up on payment of the ransom. "I have been expecting you," the governor said. "I have received a letter from the Pasha stating that he had written to the Grand Master respecting the ransom of the Aga, and sending me the amount which Suleiman's son had offered. The young man was not of age when his father was captured, but he is so now, and was therefore able to raise the sum required. I will go down to the port with you myself, hand over the ransom, and welcome Suleiman, whom I know well, back from his captivity." The transfer was speedily made, a heavy purse was handed to Jervis, and Suleiman was a free man. "Send me word, if you can, when you return to Rhodes," the latter said, as he bade farewell to the young knight. "I shall be anxious until I hear. Fortune was with us as we sailed hither, but it may desert you on your return. Should aught befall you, tell your captors that if they bring you to me, I will pay any ransom that they could, in fairness, require. Should they refuse to do this, send, if possible, a messenger to me, and on receipt of your message I will send a trusty man to purchase your freedom. You have treated me as a friend and an equal, and a friend I shall always remain." The vessel was to remain 4 days in port, to discharge her cargo and take in another, and Suleiman had talked of remaining at Acre until she sailed, but Jervis protested strongly against this. "You have your family, from whom you have been so long separated, awaiting your return with anxiety, and I pray you to make no stay on my account. I am well content to remain on board here, and to look at the city which has so often been the theatre of great deeds, which Richard the Lionheart captured, and which so many of the Hospitallers died to defend. I was charged by the Grand Master not to land, and indeed I feel myself that it would be an act of folly to do so. There are doubtless many on shore who have relatives and friends now working as slaves among us, and some of these might well seek to avenge them by slaying one of the order. I feel your kindness, but it would be a pain to me to know that you are lingering here on my account, when you must be longing to embrace your children." The 4 days passed rapidly. Jervis had, at the suggestion of the governor, laid aside the mantle and insignia of the order. "If you do not do so," he said, "I must place a strong guard of soldiers on board, in order to ensure that the Pasha's safeguard is not violated. Sailors are a turbulent race, and were you recognized here they might make a tumult, and slay you before a word of what was going on reached me. In any case I shall place 2 soldiers on board until you leave the port." On the morning of the 5th day the sails were got up, and the vessel sailed out from the port. Fortune again favoured them, and they reached Rhodes without any adventure. Jervis went at once to the palace, and handed over the purse of gold to the treasurer. He then sent up his name to the Grand Master, and was immediately conducted to his room. "I am glad to see you back, Tresham. I have been uneasy about you. Have you fulfilled your mission without adventure?" "Without any adventure, sir, save that we were once chased by a pirate on our way east, but escaped in the darkness. Save for that, the voyage has been wholly uneventful. I have received the ransom, and handed the purse to your treasurer. I am glad that your first command has turned out so well. I will see that you do not lack employment, and the fact that you are able to act as interpreter will ensure you are welcome on any galley. At present, however, it is not my intention to send out many cruisers. Every life now is precious, and no amount of spoil that can be brought in will counterbalance the loss of those who fall. However, I may find some mission on which you can be employed. I know that you love an active life, and as, for 9 months, you have put a rein on your inclinations, and have devoted yourself wholly to study so that you might be of greater use to the order, you have a good right to any employment in which your knowledge can be utilized. On his arrival at the auberge, Gervais was very heartily greeted by the younger knights. I told you you were born lucky, Gervais, Ralph Harcourt said. There has been more than one wager made that you would be captured, but I, for my part, was confident that your good fortune would not desert you. Still, though not surprised, we are delighted to see you again. Now tell us about your voyage. Gervais gave a brief account of the adventure with the pirate, and then described the visit of the governor to the ship. Did he say anything to you? He was courteous and solemn, just the sort of man you would fancy a Turkish governor should be. He looked a little surprised when I accosted him in Turkish, but asked no questions at the time, though I dare say he inquired afterwards of Suleiman how I came to speak the language. The only time he actually said anything was when he requested that I would not wear the mantle of the order while in port, as sailors were a turbulent race, and it might lead to an attack upon me, and as he was responsible to the Pasha that his safe conduct should be respected, it would be necessary, if I declined to follow his advice, to keep a strong body of soldiers on board. As this would have been a horrible nuisance, especially as I wanted to enjoy in quiet the view of the city, with its castle and walls, I acceded at once to his request, which seemed to me a reasonable one. He did send 2 soldiers on board, but they remained down in the waist, and did not interfere with my pleasure in any way. Next to Jerusalem, how I should like to see Acre! Ralph Harcourt exclaimed. It is, of all other cities, the most closely connected with our order. We helped to win it, and we were the last to defend it. We have heard so much about the fortress, and it has been so often described to me, that I know the situation of every bastion, at least, as it was when we left it, though I know not what changes the Turks may since have made. That I know not, Ralph. Of course, I only saw the seafront, and it was upon the land side that the attack was made. We know that the breaches were all repaired long ago, and it is said that the place is stronger than ever. From the port all was solid and massive. It is indeed a grand and stately fortress. Here we have done all that was possible to make Rhodes impregnable, but nature did nothing for us, their nature has done everything, and the castle looks as if it could defy the assaults of an army, however large. And indeed, it was not wrested from us by force. The knights, when the city walls were stormed and the town filled with their foes, fought their way down to the water's edge and embarked there, for they were reduced to a mere handful, and however strong a castle may be, it needs hands to defend it. Still, it well nigh moved me to tears to see the Turkish banner waving over it, and to think how many tens of thousands of Christian soldiers had died in the effort to retain the holy places, and had died in vain. I wonder whether the Turks will ever be forced to relinquish their hold of the holy places? Who can tell? Sir Giles, the bailiff, who had come up to the group unobserved, said quietly. Certainly not in our time, not until the Moslem power, which threatens not only us, but all Europe, has crumbled to dust. So long as Acre remains in their power there is no hope. I say not, but that by a mighty effort of all Christendom, Palestine might be wrested from the infidels, as it was wrested before, but the past shows us that while men or nations can be stirred to enthusiasm for a time, the fire does not last long, and once again the faithful few would be overwhelmed by the odds that would be brought against them, while Europe looked on impassive, if not indifferent. No, knights, the utmost that can be hoped for is that the tide of Moslem invasion westward may be stayed. At present we are the bulwark, and as long as the standard of our order waves over Rhodes, so long is Europe safe by sea. But I foresee that this cannot last. The strongest defences, the stoutest hearts, and the bravest of hearts, cannot in the long run prevail against overpowering numbers. As at Acre, we may repel assault after assault, we may cause army after army to betake themselves again to their ships, but, as a rock is overwhelmed by the rising tide, so must Rhodes succumb at last, if left by Europe to bear alone the brunt of Moslem invasion. All that men can do we shall do. As long as it is possible to resist, we shall resist. When further resistance becomes impossible, we shall, I trust, act as we did before. We were driven from Palestine only to fortify ourselves at Your tongue runs too fast, child, her father said, as he rose and walked across to Ralph. You are welcome, Sir Ralph, very welcome. I pray you enter and join us. I will do so with pleasure, Signor Rhodes, if you will also extend your hospitality to my friend Sir Gervase Traceham. Most gladly, the merchant said. I pray him to enter. The two knights passed through the gate in the wall. All rose to their feet as they went up to the carpet and greeted Ralph with a warmth which showed that he was a favourite. He introduced Gervase to them. I wonder that I do not know your face, Sir Knight, the merchant's wife said. I thought I knew all the knights of the order by sight, from seeing them either at the public ceremonies or observing them pass in the streets. For the last 9 months Sir Gervase has been an anchorite. He has been learning Turkish and has so devoted himself to the study that even I have scarce caught sight of him, save at meals. As for walking in the streets, it is the last thing he would think of doing. I consider myself a good and conscientious young knight, but I am as nothing in that respect to my friend. I used to look upon him as my little brother, for we were at the house of the order in London together. He is 4 years younger than I am, and you know 4 years between boys makes an immense difference. Now the tables are turned, and I quite look up to him. You will believe as much as you like, Signora, of what Sir Ralph says, Gervase laughed. As you have, he says, known him for some time, you must by this time have learnt that his word is not to be taken literally. We learned that quite early in our acquaintance, the girl who had first noticed them said, with an affectation of gravity, I always tell him that I cannot believe anything he says, and I am grateful to you, Sir Knight, for having thus borne evidence to the quickness of my perception. By this time the servants had brought some more cushions, and on these Ralph and Gervase seated themselves. Wine, sherbet, and cakes were then handed round. The master of the house placed Gervase on his right hand, as a stranger. You have been among our islands, Sir Gervase? But indeed, I need not ask that, since I know that you and Sir Ralph were knighted together for your valor in that affair with the ships of Hassan Ali. We come from Lesbos. It is now 80 years since my family settled in Rhodes, and we have seen it grow from a small place to a great fortress. 'Tis a wonderful place, Gervase said. I know nothing of the fortresses of Europe, but it seems to me that no other can well be stronger than this, that is, among places with no natural advantages. The knights have always had an abundance of slaves, the merchant said, so many that they have not only had sufficient for their work here, but have been able to sell numbers to European potentates. Yes, Rhodes is wonderfully strong. That great fosse would seem as if it could defy the efforts of an army to cross, and yet the past has shown that even the strongest defences, held with the greatest bravery, can be carried by generals with immense armies, and careless how they sacrifice them so that they do but succeed. Look at Acre, for example. I was looking at it 5 days ago, Gervase said, and thinking that it was beyond the might of man to take. Do you mean that you were at Acre? The merchant asked, with surprise. Yes. I went there to hand over a captive who had been ransomed. Of course I had a safe conduct, and I was glad indeed of the opportunity of seeing so famous a fortress. You were fortunate indeed, Sir Knight, and it was, if you will pardon my saying so, singular that so young a knight should have been chosen. Assuredly, even the senior knights of the order would rejoice at the opportunity of beholding a fortress so intimately connected with the past history of the order. It was due entirely to my being able to speak Turkish, Gervase said. As my friend Sir Ralph was mentioning, I have been studying hard, and can now speak the language fluently, and as this was a necessity on such a mission, and the few knights who can so speak it are all in high office, and could hardly be asked to undertake so unimportant a service, I was selected. And you really speak Turkish well? It is an accomplishment that few, save Greeks subject to Turkey, possess. Do you intend, may I ask, to make Rhodes your home? I ask because I suppose you would not have taken this labour had you intended shortly to return to England. Yes, I hope to remain here permanently. I know that the first step towards promotion here is generally a commandery at home, but I did not enter the order with any idea of gaining office or dignity. I desire simply to be a Knight of the Cross, and to spend my life in doing faithful service to the order. A worthy ambition indeed, and one that, so far as my experience goes, very few knights entertain. I see yearly scores of young knights depart, no small proportion of whom never place foot on Rhodes again, although doubtless many of them will hasten back again as soon as the danger of an assault from the Turks becomes imminent. You see, we who dwell here under the protection of the Order naturally talk over these things among ourselves, and although, in the matter of fortifications, all will admit that enormous efforts have been made to render the town secure, it is clear that in the matter of knights to defend them there is very much left to be desired. It is all very well to say that the knights from all parts of Europe would flock hither to defend it, but the journey would be a long one, and would occupy much time, and they would probably not receive news that the Turks had sailed until the place was already invested. Then it would be difficult, if not altogether impossible, for ships with reinforcements to make their way through the Turkish fleet, and to enter the port. To man the walls properly would need a force 5 times as numerous as that which is now here. I recognize the valor of your knights, they have accomplished wonders. But even they cannot accomplish impossibilities. For a time they could hold the walls, but as their number became reduced by the fire of the Turkish cannon and the battles at the breaches, they would at last be too weak any longer to repel the onslaughts of foes with an almost unlimited supply of soldiers. That is true enough, Gervase admitted, and to my mind it is shocking that 4/5 at least of the Order, pledged to oppose the infidels, should be occupied with the inglorious work of looking after the manners and estates of the society throughout Europe, while 1/5, at most, are here performing the duties to which all are sworn. Of the revenues of the estates themselves, a mere fraction finds its way hither. Still, I trust that the greater part of the knights will hasten here as soon as danger becomes imminent, without waiting for the news that the Turkish armament has actually set forth. For an hour the 2 young knights remained on the roof, Gervase talking quietly with the merchant, while his companion laughed and chatted with the ladies and friends of their host. After they had left, with the promise that it would not be long before they repeated their visit, Ralph bantered Gervase on preferring the society of the merchant to that of his daughters. I found him a pleasant and very well-informed man, Ralph, and enjoyed my talk with him just as you enjoyed talking nonsense to his daughters and listening to their songs. Who was the man sitting next to the eldest daughter? He doesn't belong to Rhodes, but is a Greek from one of the islands, though I did not catch from which. I don't know whether he is a relative of the family, or a business connection of the merchants, or a stranger who has brought a letter of introduction to him. Nothing was said on that head. Why do you ask? I don't like the man's face. He is a handsome fellow, but has a crafty expression. He did not say much, but it seemed to me that at times, when he appeared to be sitting carelessly sipping his sherbet, he was really trying to listen to what Vrados was saying to me. He could not do so, for we were on the other side of the circle and were speaking in somewhat low tones, while the rest of you were chatting and laughing. What should he want to listen for, most sapient knight? That I can't tell, Ralph, but I am certain that he was trying to listen. Well, as you were no doubt both talking more sensibly than most of us, Ralph laughed. He certainly showed his discernment. I dare say I am wrong, Gervase said quietly, but you know we have our spies at Constantinople, and probably the Sultan has his spies here, and the idea occurred to me that perhaps this man might be one of them. Well, I am bound to say, Gervase, Ralph said, a little irritably, I have never heard so grave an accusation brought on such insufficient evidence, or rather, as far as I can see, without a shadow of evidence of any kind. We drop in upon a man who is one of our most respected merchants, whose family has been established here many years, whose interests must be the same as those of the Order, and because a guest of his does not care to take any active part in my joking with the girls, and because you imagine that there is a cunning expression on his face, you must straightway take it into your head that he must be a spy. Excuse me, Ralph, I simply said that the idea occurred to me that he might be a spy, which is a very different thing to my accusing him of being one. I am ready to admit that the chances are infinitely greater that he is an honest trader or a relation of the merchant, and that his presence here is perfectly legitimate and natural, than that he should be a spy. Still, there is a chance, if it be but 1 out of 1,000, that he may be the latter. I don't think that I am at all of a suspicious nature, but I really should like to learn a little about this man. I do not mean that I am going to try to do so. It would be an unworthy action to pry into another's business when it is no concern of one's own. Still, I should like to know why he is here. Ralph shrugged his shoulders. This comes of living the life of a hermit, Gervase. Other people meet and talk, and enjoy what society there is in the city, without troubling their heads for a moment as to where people come from or what their business is here, still less whether they are spies. Such ideas do not so much as occur to them, and I must say that I think the sooner you fall into the ways of other people the better. There is no harm done. Chapter 9 with the galley slaves. Gervase, on consideration, was obliged to own to himself that Ralph was right in saying that he had no ground whatever for suspicion against the Greek he had met at Siege of Rhodes, and he could see no means of following the matter up. It would not, he felt, be honourable to go again to the merchant's house and to avail himself of his hospitality, while watching his guest. He determined to dismiss the matter from his mind, and had, indeed, altogether done so when, a week later, it suddenly recurred to his memory. A party of slaves, under the escort of overseers and in charge of a knight who had been with them at their work on the fortifications, were passing along the street on their way back to barracks. It was already dusk, and as Gervase was going the same way as they were, he stood aside in a doorway to let them pass. He was on the point of stepping out to follow them, when he saw a man, who had been standing in the shadow of the wall, fall in with their ranks, and, as he walked, engaged in an earnest conversation with one of the slaves. He kept beside him for 100 yards or so, then passed something into the slave's hand, and turned abruptly down a side opening. There were but few people about, and in the growing darkness the action of the man passed unobserved by the overseers. Gervase, thinking the occurrence a strange one, turned down the same lane as the man. He slackened his pace until the latter was 50 yards ahead, so that he would not, had he looked round, have been able to perceive that it was a knight who was behind him. After passing through several streets, the man turned into a refreshment house. The door stood open, and as the place was brightly lit up, Gervase, pausing outside, was able to see what was going on inside. The man he had followed was on the point of seating himself at one of the tables, and as he did so Gervase recognized him as the Greek he had met at the merchant's house. He at once walked on a short distance, and then paused to think. The vague suspicions he had before entertained as to the man now recurred with double force. He was certainly in communication with one or more of the slaves, and such communication, so secretly effected, could be for no good purpose. So far, however, there was nothing he could tax the man with. He would probably deny altogether that he had spoken to any of the slaves, and Gervase could not point out the one he had conversed with. At any rate, nothing could be done now, and he required time to think what steps he could take to follow up the matter. He resolved, however, to wait and follow the Greek when he came out. After a few minutes he again repassed the door, and saw that the man was engaged in earnest conversation with another. After considering for a time, Gervase thought that it would be best for him to follow this other man when he left, and ascertain who he was, rather than to keep a watch on the movements of the Greek, who, as likely as not, would now return to the merchants. He walked several times up and down the street, until at last he saw the two men issue out together. They stopped for a moment outside, and then, after exchanging a few words, separated, the Greek going in the direction of the quarter in which lay the house of Rhodes, while the other walked towards Gervase. The latter passed him carelessly, but when the man had gone nearly to the end of the street, he turned and followed him. He could see at once that he was a lay brother of the order. This class consisted of men of an inferior social position to the knights. They filled many of the minor offices, but were not eligible for promotion. Following for 10 minutes, Gervase saw him approach one of the barracks, or prisons, occupied by the slaves. He knocked at the door, and, upon its being opened, at once entered. The matter had now assumed a much more serious aspect. This young Greek, a stranger to Rhodes, was in communication not only with some of the slaves, but with a prison official, and the matter appeared so grave to Gervase that, after some deliberation, he thought it was too important for him to endeavour to follow out alone, and that it was necessary to lay it before the bailiff. Accordingly, after the evening meal he went up to Sir John Kendall, and asked if he could confer with him alone on a matter over which he was somewhat troubled. The bailiff assented at once, and Gervase followed him to his private apartment. "Now, what is this matter, Sir Gervase?" he asked pleasantly. "Nothing serious, I trust?" "I don't know, Sir John." "That is a matter for your consideration, but it seems to me of such importance that it ought to be brought to your knowledge." The face of the bailiff grew more grave, and, seating himself in a chair, he motioned to Gervase to do the same. "Now, let me hear what it is," he said. Gervase told his story simply. A slight smile passed across the bailiff's face as he mentioned that he had met the Greek on the roof of the house of Siege of Rhodes, and had not liked the expression of his face. "Rhodes has some fair daughters, has he not?" he asked. "Yes, sir, but I know little of them. That is the only visit that I ever paid there, or, indeed, to the house of anyone in the town." Sir John's face grew grave again as Gervase recounted how he had seen the man enter into communication with a slave, and he frowned heavily when he heard of his meeting afterwards with one of the prison officers. "In truth, Sir Gervase," he said, after a pause, "this seems to be a right serious matter, and you have done wisely in informing me of what you have seen. Assuredly there is mischief of some sort in the wind. The question is how to get to the bottom of it. Of course, the Grand Master might order the arrest of this Greek and of the prison officer, but you may be sure that neither would commit himself unless torture were applied, and I, for one, have no belief in what any man says under such circumstances. The most honest man may own himself a traitor when racked with torture and may denounce innocent men. It is at best a clumsy device. What think you of the matter?" "I have hardly thought it over yet, Sir John, and certainly no plan has yet occurred to me." "Well, think it over, Sir Gervase. It is not likely that a few days will make any difference. But I will take measures to see that this Greek does not sail away from the island at present, and will speak to the port master about it. I will myself give the matter consideration, but as you have shown yourself so quick-witted in following up the matter so far, I rely upon you more than myself to carry it farther. There may possibly be some simple explanation of the matter. He may come from an island where the Turks are masters, and has, perhaps, brought a message from some relatives of a slave. As to the talk with the prison officer, it may be wholly innocent. If we should find that it is so, we will keep this matter to ourselves, if possible, or we shall get finely laughed at by our comrades for having run upon a false scent. If, on the other hand, the matter should turn out to be serious, you will assuredly get great credit for having discovered it. Therefore, turn it over in your mind tonight, and see if you can arrive at some scheme for seeing further into it before we take any steps." In the morning Gervase again called upon Sir John Kendall. "Well, Sir Gervase, I hope that you have hit upon some scheme for getting to the bottom of this matter. I confess that I myself, though I have had a sleepless night over it, have not been able to see any method of getting to the root of the affair, save by the application of torture. I do not know whether the plan I have thought of will commend itself to your opinion, sir, but I have worked out a scheme which will, I think, enable us to get to the bottom of the matter. I believe that a galley is expected back from a cruise today or tomorrow. Now, sir, my idea is that I should go on board a small craft, under the command of a knight upon whose discretion and silence you can rely, such as, for example, Sir John Boswell, and that we should intercept the galley. Before we board her I should disguise myself as a Turkish slave, and as such Sir John should hand me over to the officer in command of the galley, giving him a letter of private instructions from you as to my disposal. If they have other slaves on board, I would ask that I should be kept apart from them, as well as from the rowers of the galley. On being landed I should be sent to the prison where I saw the officer enter last night, and the slaves and rowers should be distributed among the other prisons. Thus, then, the slaves I should be placed with would only know that I had arrived in the galley with other slaves captured by it. I have no doubt I should be able to maintain my assumed character, and should in a short time be taken into the confidence of the others, and should learn what is going on. It would be well, of course, that none of the officials of the prison should be informed as to my true character, for others, besides the one I saw, may have been bribed to participate in whatever plot is going on. And do you mean to say, Sir Gervase, that you, a knight of the order, are willing to submit to the indignity of being treated as a slave? To keep up the disguise long enough to be taken into the confidence of the plotters, you might have to stay there for some time, and if the prison officials believe you to be but an ordinary slave, you will be put to work either on the walls or in one of the galleys. I am ready to do anything for the benefit of the order and the safety of Rhodes that will meet with your approval, Gervase replied. It will no doubt be unpleasant, but we did not enter the order to do pleasant things, but to perform certain duties, and those duties necessarily involve a certain amount of sacrifice. Do you think you would be able to maintain the character? Because you must remember that if detected you might be torn in pieces by the slaves, before the officers could interfere to protect you. I feel sure that I can do so, Sir John. What story would you tell them? I would say that I had come from Syria and sailed from Acre in a trader, which is perfectly true, and also that I was taken off the ship I was on by a galley, which would not be altogether false, as I crossed one as I landed. I think there would be very little questioning, for I should pretend to be in a state of sullen despair, and give such short answers to questions that I should soon be left alone. The scheme is a good one, Sir Gervase, though full of danger and difficulty. If you are ready to row, the order was given, the galley slave ceased rowing, and the boat ran alongside. Gervase unclasped his mantle and gave it to Sir John, and then followed him on board. I congratulate you on your return, and on your good fortune in having, as your letter stated, made a prosperous voyage, Sir John said, as he shook hands with the commander of the galley. I would speak a word with you aside, he added in a low voice. Sir Almeric moved with him a few paces from the other knights. I am sent here by our bailiff, Sir Almeric. I have a Turkish prisoner here with me who is to be landed with those you have taken. There are special reasons for this, which I need not now enter into. Will you let him sit down here by the helm? My instructions are that he is not to mingle with the other slaves, and as there are reasons why it is wished that his coming on board in this manner shall not be known to them, I myself am to take him up to one of the prisons, or at least to hand him over to the officer sent down from that prison to take up the captives allotted to it. The matter is of more importance than it seems to be, or, as you may imagine, I should not be charged to intercept you on such an errand. Of course, I don't understand anything about it, Sir John, but will do as you ask me. He went to where Gervase had crouched down by the bulwark, beckoned him to follow, and, walking aft, motioned to him to sit down there. Then he returned to Sir John, and joined the other knights, who were all too anxious to learn the latest news, who had left the island, and who had come to it since they sailed, to interest themselves in any way with the figure who had gone aft, supposing him, indeed, to be Sir John's servant, the lantern suspended over the poop giving too feeble a light for his costume to be noted. A quarter of an hour later they anchored in the harbour. Some of the knights at once went ashore to their respective auberges, but Sir Almeric and a few others remained on board until relieved of their charge in the morning, an account being sent on shore of the number of captives that had been brought in. No thought was given to Gervase, who slept curled up on the poop. Sir John Boswell passed the night on board. In the morning an officer came off with a list of the prisons to which the slaves were to be sent. Sir John Kendall had seen the officer charged with the distribution, who had, at his request, not included the prison of St. Pelagius in the list. A message, however, had been sent to that prison, as well as to the others, for an officer to attend at the landing stage. In the morning Sir John went ashore in one of the boats conveying the slaves, of whom some 40 had been captured. Gervase followed him into the boat, and took his seat by the others, who were too dispirited at the fate which had befallen them to pay any attention to him. When he landed, Sir John asked which was the officer from St. Pelagius. One stepped forward. "This is the only slave for you," he said, pointing to Gervase. "He is of a better class than the rest, and in the future maybe he will do for a servitor at one of the auberges, but none have at present occasion for one, and so he is to go to you. He says that his father is a merchant, and will be ready to pay a ransom for him, but they all say that, and we must not heed it overmuch. As he seems a smart young fellow, it may be that he will be sent to one of the auberges later on, but at present, at any rate, you can put him with the rest, and send him out with the gangs. He is a well-built young fellow, Sir John," the officer remarked, "and should make a good rower in a galley. I will put him in the crew of the St. Elmo. Follow me," he said, in Turkish, to Gervase, and then led the way up to the prison. On entering he crossed a courtyard to a door which was standing open. Within was a vaulted room, some 40 feet long by 20 wide, along each side there were rushes strewn thickly. "The others have just started to their work," he said, "so that for today you can sleep." After he had left, Gervase looked with some disgust at the rushes, that had evidently been for weeks unchanged. "I would rather have the bare stones, if they were clean," he muttered to himself. "However, it can't be helped." He presently strolled out into the courtyard, where some other slaves, disabled by illness or injuries, were seated in the sun. Gervase walked across to them, and they looked listlessly up at him as he approached. "You are a newcomer," one said, as he came up. "I saw you brought in, but it didn't need that. By the time you have been here a week or two, your clothes will be like ours," and he pointed to his ragged garments. "When did you arrive? Are there no others coming up here?" "The galley came in last night," Gervase said, "but they did not land us until this morning." I wish they had killed me rather than that I should have been brought here to work as a slave. One always thinks so at first, the man said. But somehow one clings to life. We shall die when Allah wills it, and not before. What is the matter with your foot? Gervais asked. I was with the gang quarrying stones, and a mass of rock fell upon it. I have been in the infirmary for weeks, and I own that the Christian dogs treated me well. A slave has his value, you see. I am nearly cured now, but I shall never walk well again. I expect they will put me in one of their accursed galleys. How long have you been here? 7 years, it seems a lifetime. However, there is hope yet. They don't tell us much, but we hear things sometimes, and they say that the Sultan is going to sweep them out of Rhodes as they were swept out of Acre. When will it be? I know not. I am from Syria, but even there they are making preparations. The Sultan has had troubles in the east, and that has delayed him, but he will be here before long, and then we shall see. It will be our turn then. It will, indeed, one of the others exclaimed. Oh, to see these dogs brought down, and suffering as we have suffered, toiling at oars in one of our galleys, or at the fortifications of one of our castles. It will make amends for all our suffering. Had you a hard fight with them? No. We were but a small craft, and it was vain to attempt resistance. I would gladly have fought, but the sailors said it would only throw away their lives. There was but little on board, and they allowed the vessel to go free with those of the sailors who were too old to be made useful for hard work. No further questions were asked. The men seemed to have no interest save in their own misery, and Gervais soon left them, and, sitting down in a shady corner, presently dropped off to sleep. In the evening all came in from their various work. The officer-man who had brought Gervais in went up to the overseer of the galley slaves and informed him that he had told off the new slave, pointing to Gervais, to his gang. He was brought in by the galley that arrived last night. He said he was the only slave sent up here. I hear that he had been set aside to be appointed a servitor, but there are no vacancies, so they sent him here till one should occur, and I was ordered to make him useful in other ways in the meantime. I am 2 or 3 hands short, the overseer said. I wish now I had sent in an application yesterday, for if I had done so, no doubt they would have sent me some more men. However, this fellow will make up an even number, and he is strong and active, though at present he looks sulky enough under his bad fortune. A few of the slaves spoke to Gervais as they were waiting for food to be brought them, but the majority dropped upon the rushes, too exhausted with toil and heat to feel an interest in anything. The food consisted of rye bread, with thin broth, brought in a great iron vessel. Each slave had a horn, which was used for soup or water, and which, when done with, he had, by the rule enforced among themselves, to take out to the fountain in the courtyard and wash, before it was added to the pile in the corner of the room. The cool of the evening aided the meal in restoring the energies of the slaves. Several gathered round Gervais and asked questions as to what he knew of the prospects of an early invasion of Rhodes, but as soon as the officer left the room, closing and locking the door after him, the slaves became for the most part silent. A few men sat in groups together, talking in undertones, but the greater number threw themselves down on the rushes, either to sleep or to think alone. Gervais was struck by the manner in which most of them lay, without making the slightest movement, so long as there was light to enable him to make out their figures. He himself addressed 2 or 3 of them, as they lay with their eyes wide open, asking questions with reference to the work, but in no case did he receive any reply. The men seemed altogether unconscious of being addressed, being absorbed in the thought of their far-distant homes and families which they might never see again. Gervais walked a few times up and down the room, and as he approached a silence fell each time upon the groups of men talking together. More than once a figure rose soon afterwards from the ground, and, as he came along again, asked him a few questions about himself. As soon as it was dark, he lay down in a vacant space on the rushes. Shortly afterwards talking ceased altogether, and there was quiet in the vaulted room. With the first gleam of daylight they were astir, and, when the doors were opened, poured out into the courtyard, where all had a wash at the fountain. Half an hour later, a meal, precisely similar to that of the previous evening, was served out. Then the overseers called over the muster roll. The gangs were made up, and each, under its officer, started for its work. Gervais, with the men of his room, proceeded down to the port, and at once took their seats on the benches of the galley, one foot being chained to a ring in the deck, the other to that of a companion at the oar. The slaves were more cheerful now. As there was no work to do at present, they were allowed to talk, and an occasional laugh was heard, for the sun and brightness of the day cheered them. Many, after years of captivity, had grown altogether reckless, and it was among these that there was most talking. The younger men seemed, for the most part, silent and moody.